We have our early morning Saturday crew showing up. We appreciate you. Thanks for coming. I heard there's donuts in the back. That's why there's a long line back there. I see a lot of friends lining up for the donuts. Please save some for us. My name is Matt Militello. I'm a faculty member at East Carolina University and a proud member of UCA, and especially proud this year to help as a member of the UCA Conference Planning Committee. We started our engagement together around acknowledging the power of place and the wisdom of people. There is still time to visit these beautiful murals that Judith Baca has allowed us to represent as the work that we're doing here together, both in Westwood and the Great Wall of Los Angeles. And we also have experienced the wisdom of people. It's just one of the true honors is coming back to UCA and not being, it's exhausting work walking 10 meters and running into somebody that you recognize, that you haven't seen in a year, that you get to give a hug to, and also new friends, new colleagues, and we are especially proud to have representation of students all week. This morning's session, Engaging in Justice, a discussion of policies, practice, and the kind of leadership needed to realize the promise of Brown, reminds us of the Langston Hughes poem, Justice, which ends with, "Her bandage hides two festering sores that once perhaps her eyes." Hughes uses the metaphor blind goddess to convey that justice, highly desired, but people are wise to the idea that justice does not see them. In Joy in the Justice, J. Drew Lanham says, "But what I intend for us, our claim, is that joy is the justice we must give ourselves." As such, today's discussion focused on justice begins with joy. This morning, we have the third and last performance where students from the Cortinas School, which is a dual mission high school dedicated to providing aspiring artists and scholars an academically rigorous pre-college curriculum and a comprehensive pre-conservatory arts program. Again, we'll remind you, it's on Grand Avenue, just down the street. If you want to take a walk, the school offers the highest caliber of arts integrated education and opportunities to access the rich cultural vibrancy of the Los Angeles community. On Thursday, we had a trio that sang for us. Yesterday, we had 17 of the Cortinas students with us, and today we have a quartet. And I'm going to have Eddie explain the piece, right? Adrian, sorry. But please, let's give a warm and robust UCA welcome to Levi Stanley, Adrian Castillo, Eddie Morales, and Naris Gonzalez.
Good morning. Today we'll be playing Charme do Pantanal by Almir Sater, an arrangement by Paulo Simões. This piece is about a communist man escaping the dictatorship in Brazil. As the trains go through the Pantanal, the Southern Cross's stars send a signal that this is the best path for those whom, like me, are runaways from the war.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to the Cortinas School of Music. Haven't they been wonderful all week? I can't tell you what a difference having students here and the music that they've been able to perform for us has made for us, not just on the conference planning committee, but throughout the conference. It's just been truly a joy. And it helped us to refocus on the purpose and why we are doing the work that we do. It's about these students, these children, these students across the United States. So welcome to the general session number 5, Engaging in Justice, a discussion in policies, practice, and the kind of leadership needed to realize the promise of Brown. While I am in the mode of Thanksgiving, I wanted to officially recognize Nancy Parachini. Are you here? Could you come up toward the front? Nancy helped coordinate all of the student performances that are here. She, along with our planning committee, most specifically, Rebecca Chung, would you please stand up? Thank you. We appreciate it. Rebecca, stand, please. Matt Militello, would you stand? And Nate Stewart, would you stand? Okay. This is your 2024 Conference Planning Committee. If you have enjoyed any aspect of it, please let them know, because they have worked tirelessly, so much so that Nate broke his leg, literally. So we're ready to begin. Dr. Kofi Lomotey and Dr. Sheneka Williams, could you come up to the stage, please? Yesterday's conversation was designed to bring forward what works to situate our students for greater academic achievement opportunities and well-being in our schools. This conversation was created to focus our attention on which efforts we should undertake to push forward equity and excellence in public education. As we conclude the 70th anniversary year of Brown, we wanted to discuss which policies, practices, and what kind of school leadership is needed to get us to the intent of that decision. So the QR code for today is in front of you. I would like for you, please, if you're going to scan and pose questions, to do that now, because the slides will not always have it available to you. We're bringing in our featured guest, Linda Darling-Hammond, and she will be on the screens with us, so we won't have the QR code. Go ahead and scan that if you are planning to pose any questions. And the hope is that we'll be able to get to a few, but the promise is not that. We would also like to let you know that in that code, QR code, there's opportunities for the questions to be answered, even if we aren't able to address them here. All right, so I want to first talk about the decision. 70 years ago, in 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. Though Brown versus Board didn't achieve school desegregation on its own, that ruling fueled the civil rights movement in the United States. The Brown decision to desegregate schools with all deliberate speed was a clarion call for equitable schooling opportunities that still remain elusive to certain student populations. The brilliance of that decision lies in Chief Justice Warren's opinion when he acknowledged the negative impact a sense of inferiority had on the motivation of a child. That opinion was largely influenced by the studies of Kenneth and Mamie Clark, and it evidenced the psychological damaging effects of segregation, specifically at that time on African American students. Specifically stated was to generate a feeling of inferiority as to the status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. With respect to the inherent inequalities in separating students and the feelings of inferiority that it provokes, Warren's specificity precisely embodied the spirit of Brown, and why excellence and equity cannot be achieved without understanding the role psychology plays in deep learning. While Brown explicitly addressed physical school segregation, facilities, resources, and faculty, the spirit of the ruling was not confined to brick-and-mortar school experiences. Forms of reimagined segregation, many we all know and study, such as tracking, charter schools, and most recently, the increased private school funding with public dollars. Those practices continue to yield distinctly different learning experiences, thus distinctly different opportunities and life trajectories. With this in mind, we are going to start with our panel discussing, there's 3 questions, there's actually 5, but 3 questions, core questions we will get to, and Linda will appear in front of you on the screens as we begin. Ready? Okay. Hi, Linda. Hello, can you hear me? There you are. Hi, Linda.
Hello, great to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited about this conversation and all that you are able to share with us. Each panelist, all 3, will begin with this first question to talk to us a little bit about where they enter into the conversation about Brown. The question is, and I'll start with Linda, and then we'll move to Kofi and then to Sheneka. The question, over your career, how have you professionally found your positioning with respect to the Brown decision? Essentially, the question is, how do you enter into the conversation professionally for justice and school equity?
Starting with a real easy question there. Thank you very much. I will just say that I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I benefited personally from Brown and from the following and the subsequent actions that took place. The Brown case, of course, was many decades in the making, and there were lots of lawsuits, some of them on the inequality in funding and some of them on the desegregation element that was tied to the inequality in funding. And it was this, Brown ended up being won on the desegregation claim, but really the inequality in resources was also undergirding that. So following Brown, there was all kinds of, with civil rights marches, you remember there was massive resistance from governors in the South that needed to be countered with, a great deal of civil rights activity, which I'm sure everyone is well aware of, but then it was followed by school finance reform initiatives. It was followed by all of the federal investments in Title I and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, Pell Grants, funding to colleges, et cetera, desegregation at the college level. So as I say, I benefited from many of those things growing up in that era before the door closed again when Ronald Reagan became president, and many of those policies were undone. So we had this enormous gain in achievement for Black students in the 60s and 70s. And the smallest achievement gap we ever had was in the 1980s, before those Reagan reforms took place, and our achievement gap now is 30% larger than it was, almost 40 years ago. But in seeing both the opportunities that could be available and that I and many others benefited from, that really became a professional agenda for me. I went into teaching because I felt I had gotten the benefit of a good education, and both at K-12 and higher ed. And then I went on into my initial work in school finance reform. And I did work in that area, researched, and also testified in about 15 lawsuits going after, in most cases, equitable funding. In other cases, desegregation continued to be part of the legal agenda. And so since then, of course, there's a lot of other ways in which equity is essential. We lost a lot of black teachers during desegregation. Desegregation was not a uniform benefit to all black students and to all black schools. So we lost a lot of teachers. We lost some schools that had really supported young people. All of that, we lost safe and inclusive environments for a lot of black students who were in environments that were hostile. We're still struggling with all those issues. So all of those then have become part of the professional agenda for equity is how do we get to the place where in whatever schools kids attend, they have the teachers who care for them, the leaders who are aimed at equity, and the safe, inclusive environments that are productive.
Wonderful, thank you. Kofi? Dr. Lomotey?
Kofi's fine. Good morning. It's good to see you, Linda.
Good to see you.
I'd like to begin by adding my token of appreciation to all of you for coming out this morning, early morning on a Saturday. I want to talk about what I've been thinking over the last 50 years. Ever since I was in undergraduate school at Oberlin College in Ohio 50 years ago, I've been concerned about the limited academic, social, cultural, and spiritual success of black children in U.S. public schools. Virtually all of my writing and my activism has been focused on addressing this challenge. In 1990, 36 years after the Brown decision, I published an edited book entitled Going to School, The African American Experience. In the introduction to that 1990 volume, I said the following, quote, "The status of African American students is the most critical issue facing educators today. Will we rise to the challenge as we approach the 21st century and create an environment where African Americans will be able to compete academically in America's public schools?" End quote. Unfortunately, little has been done in the 34 years since the publication of this book to improve upon the success of black children in U.S. public schools. Jim Sherrick refers to this as spirit death. This is not an accident. It's by design. The Brown decision, while it helped some people, overall was less effective than it might have been, largely because of the impact of institutionalized white racism, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Thank you, Sheneka. Dr. Williams?
Thank you.
They're my friends. I just keep forgetting who they are.
Hello, hello.
Push this.
Okay, I think I'm on. First, I'd like to say I must be living right to be on a panel with Kofi and Linda. Second, I'd like to say thank you to all of you who've come out this morning for this very important topic that we've been discussing for 70 years. And as Kofi just said, we're questioning where we are 70 years later. How do I come into this work, and how do I think about Brown and the legacy of Brown? I tend to think about Brown through the lens of someone who grew up in the segregated South, right? Whose grandfather was the principal of a one-room schoolhouse, whose father and uncles and aunts went to school in that one-room schoolhouse. I come to this work as someone whose first 3 teachers were black women. So I come to this work understanding what a pre-Brown context might have looked like. No, I'm not old enough, I did not experience that. But I have some idea of what that could have been. I think about this too, not just necessarily as a teaching and learning lesson. I think about Brown from a resource perspective, but I also understand that that's also maybe not enough. And so when I think about the Brown decision, where we are today, as Linda said, in the 1980s, we peaked at some of the academic achievement for Black students. We're seeing what's happening with housing policy. We're seeing what's happening with schools resegregating. I'm interested with my work in what's happening in classrooms. My dissertation study was around students who attended a magnet school in the South, in a southern city. And I was interested in knowing at that time if students were becoming friends or engaging with each other in that space. And I found that just like Brown, that effort sometimes was one-dimensional, or it was one way. And so I'm trying to continue to grapple with what does this mean for student learning? Because we've placed students in schools together. But what is the overall education that our students need, right? And I understand that there's a social education that students get from school, but there's also an academic education that students get. And so I entered into this by saying, over the years, my thoughts have ebbed and flowed on the legacy of Brown and how do we move forward.
Thank you very much. Prepared responses from Dr. Lomotey and Dr. Darling-Hammond on this question. Given the shift under the new administration to push more educational oversight to the states, how can school leaders pursue equity and justice in their schools when district and state level politics create opposition, not only for leaders, but also for researchers? Kofi, would you start with that?
I made the observation that we're still challenged by institutionalized white racism. So I want to begin by talking about what I mean by that. The U.S. is a country wherein individuals and groups are oppressed or victimized based upon a number of invalid and wrongful criteria, including gender, religious affiliation, economic status, height, weight, beauty, whatever that is, ableness, sexual orientation, and race. While I do not intend to downplay the oppression that people experience in this country based upon the other aforementioned factors, I want to focus in this discussion on the institutionalized white racism that permeates this country. And I intentionally said institutionalized white racism because while anyone may have racist ideas or thoughts, the behavior associated with institutionalized racism can only be practiced by people who have power over others. Wade Nobles defines power as the capacity to interpret reality and to persuade others that it is their reality. When one group holds power over other groups and there are cultural differences, the group in power seeks to maintain the status quo and to convince others that the dominant culture is in fact their culture. Institutions in U.S. society operate in concert to perpetuate racist practices. That is political, educational, economic, religious, health, military, social, and cultural institutions are designed in part to facilitate the oppression of people who have no power. Based upon race, as well as other characteristics. This is an overpowering, intense, and dynamic phenomenon. Many of us, consciously or unconsciously, harbor racist ideas. This is all reflective of the tremendous impact of institutionalized racism. What does this have to do with the 1954 Brown decision and black education? Where's the racism? After Brown, 18 states issued resolutions of interposition declaring the Brown decision illegitimate, and they chose not to enforce it. Gerrymandering has occurred in the North with the explicit intent of facilitating residential segregation and consequently segregated schools. Segregation in schooling prevented equal protection under the law. It was in part a component of manifest destiny, institutionalized white racism or white supremacy. In this country, brown, black, and yellow people were, and some still argue are, considered inferior. The racist strategies were conquest, enslavement, and internment, respectively. Many public schools in the U.S. were more segregated in 2016 than they were before the Brown decision. Where residential trends, white flight, brought about resegregated schools, court orders requiring desegregation were suspended, and most schools resegregated within 6 years of the Brown decision. Residential segregation and suburbanization contribute largely to school segregation.
Thank you. Thank you. Invite Linda. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Linda?
Well, I want to start by building on what Kofi has been describing. The degree to which anti-Black racism is still alive and well in our schools is very, very strong. My son, actually, Sean Darling-Hammond, just issued a paper in ARA Open Journal called Any Way You Slice It. And he looks at the data on school exclusions, suspensions, and expulsions by race and slices it by every imaginable way of looking at it with every kind of risk ratio and so on. And it is still the case that on any dimension, Black students are excluded from school at much higher rates than any other group of students. Students with disabilities are also in that category, and Black students identify with disabilities have the highest rates of exclusion. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates that that's not because of differential behaviors, it's because of differential punishments or treatment for students. We have studies that show, for example, in a study of early childhood teachers that were asked to look for the problematic behaviors and troublemakers in the classroom. There were, by the way, no problematic behaviors in this video that they were asked to watch. Their eyes went to the Black students and they started looking for and finding, ways to critique. So the depth of the embeddedness of anti-Black racism is, very much a part of schooling. And your question was, what do we do when, the shift goes to the states? And what do we do when districts and states are not encouraging equity? I will say that over the course of these last 70 years since Brown, the federal government has not always been an advocate. We had the moments where President Eisenhower sent the troops to Little Rock and FDR and JFK, and then LBJ did a variety of very important progressive moves, but then in every of the administrations, Reagan and the two Bushes and Trump administrations, the federal government has actually been actively litigating on the side of segregation rather than desegregation. So the federal government is not an unremitting advocate for the work. States vary in how they have taken up civil rights. There are probably about 15 or 20 states that are working now to strengthen their civil rights protections in the wake of the election so that they can be bulwarks. But then there are, of course, so many educators and children in states where there is going to be even more difficulty enacting equitable practices. One of the things I think about, however, is that everything in the United States is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We should never imagine that progress is like a linear, progression. There's always pushback. Where there is progress, there is pushback. So we're going to experience that. But people have always found ways to move ahead. Sort of quiet pursuit of equity can be very effective. It is often the case that you need to kind of look at ways to take up the issues that have been named already, the issues of exclusionary and disparate discipline in your school, the issues of tracking that sort and select as the eugenicists who helped design the factory model school intended, would be the case, that there are quiet ways to do that. We just recently put together a book that's coming out in the next few months on racial equity leadership, looking at places in the South where successful leaders over a long period of time, in good times and bad, have made progress. And I think about Dr. Freddie Williamson, who is a wonderful educator, who was superintendent in Hope County, North Carolina, which has been part of multiple school finance lawsuits because it has been under-resourced for so long. But Freddie came in and dramatically changed, the landscape of opportunity, the landscape of equity in a very poor, rural, diverse school district. And he did that by just working with leaders, with school leaders. He was careful about selecting school leaders. He had to eliminate some positions and bring in other people, but then doing that by looking at the data over and over again and using the mantra, all means all. All means all. Everything we're trying to do, are we getting to all students? And in a very quiet way, bringing the board along and bringing and enabling his principals to lead, he closed achievement gaps, dramatically raised achievement and graduation rates, and he's just an example of many other leaders out there who just have a deliberate, quiet, continuous pursuit of equity. And I think that will be one of the things we have to help people do together with collaboration with their colleagues over this period of time. And now some people think about the next 4 years, but we have a midterm election in 2 years. So I think what we do over the next 2 years in the states and at the federal level is going to be very important to create the room for that work to go on.
Thank you. That's very important. I'm glad you brought that up. Dr. Williams and Dr. Darling-Hammond, question number 3 is posed for your response. Let me get to that. Also considering the shift in administration, how might some of the progress that was made by Brown be further affected? Sheneka, would you start us, please?
Sure. I want to start by saying, or going back to what Kofi said and some of what Linda has said. I mean, the Brown decision began to unravel as soon as it was decided. So, and I'm thinking about in places in the Deep South like Alabama and Mississippi, there's still some places in the Deep South that mimic pre-Brown days. So there have been some limitations to Brown while there have been a lot of successes to Brown. But I'd also like to say you know, we go back to the 80s, as we said, where schools were probably the most desegregated. The achievement of Black students might have been the highest, and I'm interested to see with some policies that might come forth, how that might be affected. But I also think about this from a higher ed perspective, right? And what this might mean for some of the funding programs for students to go to college. Like what might happen with Pell Grant dollars. I was looking at some NCES data the other day, and for Black students, all students, but I was looking at the data for Black students. We have 57% of students of Black students who access Pell Grant dollars. What might that mean? What might that mean for student loan dollars? So I think about that when we think about this new presidential administration. And I'd also like to say, you know, Brown has set some legal precedents for other civil and human rights issues in this country, right? So other than what it means for students who go to school and whether or not those schools will be integrated, I also think about what this might mean for LGBTQ students. So I think there are a lot of questions that we can ask and grapple with based on the legal precedents set by Brown. So that's what I'm thinking about with this new administration. But I'd be very interested to hear what Linda has to say.
Linda?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that you've said, and I want to just add a couple of other variables. I mean, one of the things that we know is that there will be attacks on civil rights for, you know, students of color, for LGBTQ students and others that are going to need to be defended. You know, I will say, I lead an organization that is a research and policy organization that many of our colleagues in Washington, D.C. are already organizing, you know, to figure out, how to download all the data sets and the guidance that will be needed to be relied on, how to be organizing our lawyers to be, you know, able to defend against the attacks and to take other issues forward on the offense, et cetera. But we can anticipate that. We can anticipate, of course, as you said at the beginning, that vouchers will be on the table to try to reduce public school funding. We did at LPI do a study of the vouchers in Arizona, which were originally put in place and said to probably cost $30 million. They're now up very close to $1 billion, you know, in expenditures, and just highlighting, I think, as we think about what researchers will need to do, highlighting what the effects of policies are as quickly as we can, so that others can take advantage of it. We now see red states, for example, where rural Republicans are defeating vouchers because they don't bring any money to the schools in the rural areas where private schools are not, you know, established, and they take money away from the public schools that they see essential to their communities. So I think we have to be thinking about as these policies come forward that are intending to benefit the wealthy, in many cases, how we organize to protect against those in the states. And then I think we have to look at whether there are ways to make progress elsewhere. One of the interesting things is that that I'm wondering about is whether with Elon Musk as a factor in this administration, we can get to you know, green electric school buses across the country or other things that, you know, take advantage of the odd situation that we're in. But we definitely have to be prepared for, you know, the kinds of moves that have been telegraphed already, and look for the opportunities to bring more political heft to the side of rationality.
Excellent, great. And this question number 4 is for all. Put it up for you all. What valuable lessons did Black communities learn pre-Brown that are transferable to school communities today? the lessons of Brown. Linda, would you start us off?
Well, we've already talked a little bit about the fact that before Brown, of course, black schools in most places were severely under-resourced, but they also had many deeply committed, highly talented teachers and leaders who created very caring environments for learning. And, that continues today in settings that are not desegregated, and in some that are, but it's the struggle to reclaim places where black students could be loved, accepted, supported, unequivocally seen as brilliant and supported in their progress has been much harder to achieve in desegregated settings. And you just look at, with my own family, we've been through the process with so many other folks have experienced where, as my daughter said, when we moved to California, she couldn't go to any of the public high schools nearby us because she would be the only black student in the honors class. And these are communities where 40, 50, 60% of the students might be students of color, but they were not in the advanced classes and the honors track, and we still see this all across the country. That's sorting, that's selecting, as I noted, the exclusionary and disparate discipline. So finding a way back to the environment of acceptance and of encouragement and of affirmation is incredibly important. And I think we need to be really focused on that. I'll just say one other thing. There's been a whole raft of studies that have come out that have found the benefits of black teachers for black students. I think those benefits come from that, affirmation and support and encouragement that is otherwise often missing for black students.
Agreed, thank you. Kofi?
I think that Vanessa Siddle Walker and several others have done a pretty good job of describing the nature of black education prior to Brown, but they quickly also note that there were challenges there. In my mind, the good thing is that we already know exactly what we need to do to bring about success for all students. Everybody in this room knows the kinds of things that we need to do. Now, I'll just mention a few of them. We need to seek a diverse faculty and administration, not just at K-12 levels, but in higher education. I've taught full-time on 4 or 5 campuses over the last 40 years. And invariably, what I observed in faculty searches is that we spend a lot of time developing the job description. We send it out, and we sit down and wait for people to apply, as opposed to contacting people that we know across the country and letting them know what we're looking for, and then pursuing those recommendations that are made. We need to let all students, again, K-12 and higher ed, see some teachers and some administrators who look like them. Second, we need to provide a culturally responsive education. We need to emphasize the cultures of the learners in the curriculum. We need to let all children see themselves in the curriculum. To teach them concepts and ideas, provide illustrations with which they are familiar. Third, we need to provide ongoing professional development for faculty. Fourth, we need to challenge higher ed institutions to develop educational leadership programs and teacher education programs that show scholars, scholar practitioners, and students how to disrupt inequitable and socially unjust K-12 schools. We need to prepare all teacher education candidates and ed leadership candidates, not just white middle-class Protestant male candidates. The programs need to meet the needs of all of our students. Number 5, we need to believe that all children can learn and to treat them in the way that we would treat our own biological children. And then finally, we need to provide as many per pupil dollars for all students as there are presently allocated for students in predominantly white schools. We need to meet the needs of all students. That's not much.
Yeah, no. Short list. Just a few things to do. Thank you, Kofi. Sheneka.
So Kofi just had a list of 7 items, I believe, and 2 of those were on my list. So that's a mic drop. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. Fair enough. Thank you. Identifying the implications for scholars. UCEA, yes, we have a lot of clinicians and practitioners as part of our body, but we still remain a heavy research community. So what exactly are the things that we should research, and in what ways should research inform us about how to continue this conversation? Very clearly, even in the 70 years since Brown, the conversation remains viable and important, and the research that we continue to do and bring back to our communities has to be focused on those matters around equity and excellence. So share with us, what research do you think it is that we should be engaging in to continue the conversation and elevate the conversation? Anyone who wants to go first, please jump in.
Let me say a few things that I think suggest ideas for research. First, I know of no educational reforms, including the Brown decision, that have benefited the majority of black children. Today, schools in many cities are more segregated than they were 50 years ago. While legal segregation may no longer exist, segregation rooted in social norms is widespread. And I'm not convinced yet that black students are more likely to be successful merely because they're sitting next to white students. The Brown decision made less of an impact than it might have otherwise made. While some people benefited, racism still prevails in this country. By 1964, less than 1% of black children in the South attended desegregated schools. By 2005, 51 years after the Brown decision, 73% of black students were in public schools, with black and Latinx students in the majority, and where white students represented less than 50% of the population. By the way, white students are the most segregated students in U.S. public schools. The average white student in U.S. public schools is in a school where 77% of the students are white. And whites today make up only 45% of the U.S. public school population. Again, I'm aware of no so-called school reforms, and this is an opportunity for some research. Not charter schools, not No Child Left Behind, not busing, and not Brown that have substantially boosted the success of black children. None of them have. I said it in 1990, and I continue to believe that the criminally high level of failure of black children in U.S. public schools has been persistent, pervasive, and disproportionate. One cannot identify a school district, a city, or a state wherein the majority of black children have done well?
That is true. I'm going to ask you a question, though, not to contradict. Brown, although, as we've discussed, and you elaborate, did not sustain change, as we started this conversation and the stats that Linda brought, there was change in the 60s and 70s, and most specifically in the 80s. So the pushback rolls back some of the progress consistently in some of these initiatives, but I don't want to walk away feeling as though the initiatives themselves are not useful or beneficial or a step as we continue to move towards that arc of justice.
I'd love to jump in here if this is a good place. Although, Kofi, you may want to respond.
I think he was.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Linda.
Well, I think that, given that the pushback is always going on, as you say, we don't want to lose the fact that there are some things that have made a difference for periods of time in some places for some students, right? And I think there's three kinds of research that we need to think about. One is to continue to identify the problems and the disparities and the inequalities so that they're clear and they're present, and understand, and dig into why they exist. And that becomes the stuff of civil rights litigation and other, forms of justice seeking. But the other is then to look for places where there are some solutions that are making a difference, moving the needle. And then third, to understand how to implement them in productive ways that can scale. So I think that there's all of those pieces. Pedro Noguera and I have worked over the years on looking at schools that are redesigned in various ways and that are producing success for Black students, for other students of color.
He was our guest yesterday and shared.
Oh, that's great. And he'll talk about a school, he might have done that in Los Angeles, where Black students are achieving at high levels and, going on to college at high levels and so on. But there are other of those kinds of individual schools. That's not to understate Kofi's point, which is that none of this is happening at scale over time. You have these moments, but then trying to unpack what the strategies are to create more of those kinds of schools and to scale up and to get to the solutions, I think, is part of it. Rucker Johnson does a lot of economic research. He wrote Children of the Dream about the effects of desegregation just a year or two ago. And has looked at school finance reforms and other things. And one of the things I appreciate about his work is that he, has identified the inequalities, looked at investments that do create much greater equity, and then he probes in to say, well, what caused that? So, for example, in his study of desegregation, he found that basically it was the increased resources for students, it was the smaller class sizes and the better prepared teachers that made, the differences that he was able to track. You could have those things in segregated or desegregated settings if you understand what the building blocks are. We see, again, a lot of exclusionary discipline is a big hit on Black students' achievement and graduation rates. There are places that are implementing restorative practices in productive ways. There are also a lot of places that are saying they're doing it and doing a bad job and missing the mark. So then you have to look at where we know that we can get stronger outcomes from these kinds of practices. What are the implementation lessons that are needed for leaders to put those kinds of practices into effect? So I don't disagree that we have not reached the promise of Brown in any way, but that there is a research agenda that we can construct that can help us continue to make progress in looking at both the problems, the solutions, and the strategies for implementing them.
Wonderful, thank you.
And then carrying those into our leader preparation programs and our teacher preparation programs.
Right, I was gonna
Because at the
circle
end of the
back.
day, right, there you go.
That's exactly right. Sheneka?
Yes, I was just going to add to that. I was thinking about this audience in particular. This is primarily a leadership and policy audience. I was thinking in terms of policy, we probably need some more research that is more community engaged policy research. I think too often policy research sometimes can be top down and the community isn't forgotten. And so the research is done unto instead of with. And so there are some cases where that is happening. I know with some of Sarah Linoff's work in Detroit and what's happening there. So I think there are some cases where we might see that where that could be replicated or is transferable to other sites. But I also think about for leadership, like we have culturally responsive school leadership and leadership for social justice, and they've all made great strides. But I also think, we also have to think about in our schools, what is the research around leadership for inclusivity, right? Because just because it's a diverse environment doesn't mean it's an inclusive one.
That's right.
And how do we conduct studies that helps us further get at that and what's really happening inside communities first, but also inside schools and classrooms.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a few audience questions that I'd like to try to entertain. The first audience question is, how should the critical race theory critique of Brown inform efforts to fulfill its promise? How should the critical race theory critique of Brown inform efforts to fulfill its promise?
There's so many critiques one can make of Brown, so I'm trying to think about which of them is intended in that question.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure which critical race theory critique. Is the audience member here? Addressing inequality and mathematical imbalance for?
Using mathematical balance of school attendance.
Of school attendance.
I think we've spoken to the fact that just having white students and black students and students of other backgrounds sitting next to each other is not enough. And I think that is one of the critiques. It's not a mathematical imbalance problem. It's, a problem of valuing students, getting resources to them, affirming them, and, all of the other things we've been talking about, which are not associated with the, mathematical imbalance problem that is a very fair critique of Brown.
Thank you. What information do leaders, going back to Sheneka's point about who is engaging in this conference, what information do leaders need to know to stand strong in the face of political backlash to equity and justice-oriented policies? Particularly, I think, in this question is embedded in many of the communities where parents have a great say in the administration, and the administrators are trying to fulfill good policies. So how do leaders stand strong in the face of political backlash toward equity and justice-oriented policies?
Repeat that one more time.
What information do leaders need to know to stand strong in the face of political backlash to equity and justice-oriented policies?
This is very surface level, but I think under surface level, leaders need to understand who's in their buildings, right? Who's in the school communities. Where are the allies in some of this backlash? I think so. At first, leaders need to know who's in their buildings, who's in the communities the schools serve. But I think on a higher level, school leaders need to, this is probably a time if school leaders have not been attuned to what's happening on your local school board, what's happening in your state level politics. I think this is a time where leaders need to make sure they're attuned to what's really happening. I think sometimes, and I have not been a school leader, I assume we have an audience full, but there are some things happening on the day-to-day where school leaders don't get a chance to focus on what's happening at a policy level as much. But I would say we're coming to a time, or we've been at a time, where school leaders or someone in that building needs to be attuned to what's happening with state-level policy decisions and district-level policy decisions, because that will impact what's happening in the school and also what's the groundswell from the community. So leaders are getting put in the middle, so to speak, but I think leaders need to know what's happening up top and what's happening on the ground. And that sounds very simplistic, but I don't think that's always happening.
And I'd just like to add to Sheneka's thoughts there that I think this builds on what you're saying. Leaders need to know they are not alone, and they need to be creating community so that they can act in concert and problem solve in concert with others, that they can have power, that educators can have power. In a lot of communities where school boards were taken over by Moms for Liberty and a variety of other forces, they've been recalled. There have been a lot of recalls. There have been a lot of new elections, which have brought educators to those school boards. And I think people need to just think about the fact that they can act together and can have power. And also that this too will change, particularly if we act together and take on some of that power that, this is part of the pushback, and, we continue. And you have to have a lot of stamina in this long process of bending the arc towards justice. Having the long view can be helpful.
It is a very long process, Linda. That arc is just not moving like I'd like it to.
Yeah.
Kofi, you want to add to that, or are you ready to move to closing remarks? All right, Kofi's going to start us off with closing remarks.
Let me begin, I guess 2 points. The first one I want to start with is to say something that might appear counterintuitive given what I've said thus far, and that is I'm optimistic about education in the United States. But I think it's important to understand where we are in order to get where we need to be. And so that's why I focused on where we are. And that's why it may seem like pessimism, but it's optimism. Or it's rooted in optimism. The second thing, and I've prepared a couple concluding remarks in response to your question. I conclude as I started. The status of African American students is the most critical issue facing educators today. Will we rise to the challenge as we approach the 21st century and create an environment where African Americans will be able to compete academically in America's public schools? Again, this is a 1990 quote. We must do that. More is at stake than the life chances of African Americans. The future of our entire country depends upon how well we educate African Americans and other so-called minorities in the years ahead. End quote. Finally, shortly after the 1954 Brown decision was handed down, Thurgood Marshall wandered into a celebration of NAACP staff. He frowned and said, quote, "You fools go ahead and have your fun, but we ain't begun the work yet." So now I have positioned myself regarding Brown. Well, given the lack of academic, social, cultural, and spiritual success of black children, given the fact that those realities continue to persist, my position in answer to your first question is that the struggle continues. We've still got a lot of work to do.
Closing remarks, Sheneka?
You know, I'm sitting here thinking about this class I teach. I was grading papers this morning. And I start the class, I end the class with asking, what is the purpose of education? And I'm thinking of that now. I think about it almost every day. My students know. When we're thinking about Brown and the progress we need to make for black children in particular, what is the larger purpose, right? Is the larger purpose about who they sit beside? Is it the larger purpose about the education they receive? And how do the two intersect? So I leave with this. I think there are some lessons we can learn from desegregated schools, but I also think from the education of black students in particular, we need to go back and read what was happening in segregated schools. I think there are some lessons there from what was happening in the one-room schoolhouse, right? And some of it was very simple. There was an ethos of care, and I think that care can come from more than just black teachers, but I think there are some lessons that can be learned that we either have not known or we have forgotten. And I would just say we have to think about what is the larger purpose of education, but try and answer that thinking about the opportunities and challenges of desegregated schools and the opportunities and challenges of segregated schools.
Excellent. Closing remarks, Linda?
Well, to pick up on Kofi's point about the struggle, you know, Frederick Douglass talked about the fact that there is no progress without struggle, that power concedes nothing without a demand. So there will be ongoing need for struggle. And then we have to think about how does that struggle unfold? And there are, of course, many elements of that. But to Sheneka's point, you know, a lot of this is about getting to a place of care. And I think about Martin Luther King's statement in 1967 when he said, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." And we don't talk about love very much when we talk about schooling. We have all kinds of accountability indicators and, you know, a variety of other things. But at the bottom of it, it is, you know, the capacity to love children well enough to care for them, to affirm them, to support them, and to think about everything that stands in the way of that is what we have to unpack and struggle against.
And that takes us back to what I noted as the brilliance of the decision, taking care of not only what's happening in the hearts and minds of our children as we continue to teach and seek the equity. Well, the face of UCEA is getting younger and stronger. Anniversaries are important, not just for nostalgia and romance, but to remember the intent of important events. It's an interesting irony, perhaps divine intervention, that the anniversary of UCEA aligns with the anniversary of Brown. As we celebrate the work that we guide in K-12 education, do so with the intent of making equity and excellence a reality for all of our children in this nation. I want to thank you for coming, all of you out this morning, but I also want to thank, of course, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond for making time. We really appreciate you joining us here today. Dr. Kofi Lomotey and Dr. Sheneka Williams for your brilliance in your conversation this morning. Thank you. And to the UCA family, we look forward to seeing you this evening as we enjoy our sneaker ball and walk among the stars. I know you have time, a little time. It's Saturday. You want to get out and play in LA, I know. But I'd love you to join us for our fireside chat where you can have conversation. And San Gabriel A, the executive director, I believe, will be there to answer any questions, as well as the executive committee. Thank you and have a wonderful conclusion to the conference.